The night Kwan Ixian had a woman dragged into his mountain estate, he was in the middle of losing a game of baduk to himself. Not because he lacked an opponent, because no one in his organization was willing to beat him. He sat alone at the stone table in his inner study, a room most of his men had never seen the inside of, moving black and white stones with the unhurried focus of a man who had already decided how every other thing in his life would go. The fire behind him was the only light. On his wrist, a single watch. No rings, no unnecessary things. Kwan Ixian was 36 years old and was known by 3 names depending on who you asked. The government called him Subject Kilo, a file that had been opened, stalled, reopened, and stalled again across 4 administrations. His enemies, the ones still alive, called him Hwansang, the Phantom, a man who controlled the most dangerous underground network in East Asia without ever appearing in a single confirmed photograph. His people simply called him Hyungnam, elder brother, though there was nothing brotherly about the authority behind it. He was not a large man, he was not loud. He had the kind of stillness that very dangerous things sometimes have, the stillness of deep water, of a blade not yet drawn. His face was angular and dark-eyed, and gave away nothing that he hadn't decided to give. He placed a white stone, placed a black one. The door opened. His head of security, a man named Disol, stepped in with the specific posture of someone trying to be smaller than they were. "She's here, Hyungnam. Put her in the east room." "There is," Disol stopped, "a situation." Ixian placed another stone. "Define it." "She's not, the woman we retrieved, is not Shin Bokhi." The stone hovered over the board. "Sit down." Ixian looked up for the first time. Shin Bokhi was 52 years old and controlled the financial architecture of the Mun syndicate, which had been systematically dismantling Ixian's southern port operations for 8 months. She was the operation's brain. Remove the brain, the body stumbles. It was simple surgical logic. "Then who," Ixian said, with the terrible quiet of a man who did not raise his voice because he didn't need to, "did you bring me?" Disol held out a small ID card. Ixian looked at it without touching it. A hospital badge. The photograph showed a woman with clear, watchful eyes and hair pulled back in the practical way of someone who used their hands professionally. Professor O'Sebiel, Department of Criminal Psychology and Behavioral Analysis, Yonsei University, consultant, Korea National Forensic Service. He read it twice. "A criminal psychologist," he said. "Yes." "Who consults for the National Forensic Service?" "Yes." "Is currently in my east room." "Yes." The silence stretched long enough to become architectural. "How?" said Ixian. Disol explained, swiftly and miserably. Shin Bokhi had changed vehicles at the last moment. Her assistant, an O'Sebiel, apparently had been driving Bokhi's registered car. Same model, same plates, wrong woman. The retrieval team, operating on visual confirmation of the vehicle alone, had moved. Ixian listened to all of this. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked to the east room. He had expected fear, tears, possibly, demands. The particular chaos of someone confronting something their entire life had not prepared them for. O'Sebiel was sitting in the center of the room in a straight-backed chair, ankles crossed, hands folded in her lap, studying the room with the systematic attention of someone who catalogued things for a living. She looked up when he entered. Their eyes met. She did not flinch. "You're in charge," she said, not a question. "Yes," he said. "This was a mistake," she said. "I was driving Shin Bokhi's car as a favor. She had a family dinner. I was returning it to her apartment building." She tilted her head slightly. "You wanted her, not me." "Yes." "Then you have a decision to make." She said it like she was outlining an agenda. "Logistically, I'm a problem either way. You can't use me as leverage because I have no organizational value to whoever you're moving against. And you can't simply release me because I've seen your men's faces and I'm a professional forensic consultant. She paused. Which means you're calculating a third option, and I'd like you to know that I'm aware of what that option typically looks like. She was describing her own potential death with the composure of a woman discussing a difficult case file. Ixion stood in the doorway and looked at her. "You're not afraid," he said. "I'm extremely afraid," she said. "But fear is information, not instruction. I've interviewed over 300 violent offenders. I know what panic looks like from the outside, and I've decided it won't help me right now." He stepped fully into the room. She tracked him the way prey tracks predators, precisely, without looking away. "What's your name?" he asked, though he'd already read it. "Oh, CBL." Her name meant the star just before dawn. He didn't know why he noticed that. "Professor O," he said, "you've studied men like me. Men who run organizations like yours?" "Yes, extensively." She looked at him with a directness that very few people ever managed in his presence. "You're more controlled than I expected, based on the operations profile. Your men are afraid of you but not resentful. That's an unusual combination. It suggests consequence without cruelty." She paused. "You're also deciding something right now, and you've been deciding it since you walked in, which means it isn't simple." He said nothing for a long moment. "Then you'll stay in this room tonight. It's comfortable. You won't be harmed. And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll have decided." He turned to leave. "Quan Ixion," she said. He stopped, turned. She knew his name. Of course she did. A forensic consultant for the National Forensic Service. It would have been stranger if she hadn't. "You have a reputation for precision," she said, "for never making unnecessary moves." She held his gaze. "Killing me would be an unnecessary move. I hope you'll arrive at that conclusion before morning." He left without answering. But she was right. He already had. On the second day, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He gave her access to his library. Not the estate, not freedom. Just the library, a long room on the building's north side, floor-to-ceiling shelves, a fireplace, and 3 decades of eclectic collection. History, philosophy, psychology, ironically, law, literature in 4 languages. He told himself it was because a secured, occupied prisoner was easier to manage than a restless one. He told himself it was operational logic. He did not tell himself the real reason, which was that he'd spent the previous night unable to sleep, more unable than usual. Which was already a significant problem, thinking about the way she'd said fear is information, not instruction, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. He'd been running on 3 hours a night for 9 years. It had started after the incident he did not name, the one that had restructured his understanding of what other people were, what they could become, what they would do when conditions changed. Since then, sleep had become a border he could cross only briefly before something dragged him back. His doctors called it chronic hypervigilance-induced insomnia. They'd tried 4 different medications. He stopped taking them because the fog they created was more dangerous than the exhaustion. He found her in the library at 7 a.m., already reading. She pulled a volume on behavioral economic theory and was annotating a paper notepad she'd apparently asked a guard for. "You actually sleep," he said. It came out sounding like an accusation. She looked up. 6 hours. "I'm a light sleeper, but I stay under." She studied his face. "You don't." "I sleep." "How much?" He was silent. "Quan Ixion," she said, with a firmness that should not have worked on him and did. "How many hours a night?" 3, sometimes less." She set her book down and looked at him with a focused, impersonal attention that had nothing to do with attraction or manipulation. It was professional, clinical, the way a specialist looks when they've just identified something they know how to treat. "How long?" she said. 9 years. She nodded slowly. "Hypervigilance, post-traumatic neurological reconfiguration. Your threat assessment system never fully deactivates." She tilted her head. "Something happened. A betrayal, most likely, given the profile. Someone close. You rebuilt your entire operation structure afterward, tighter, more controlled. But your nervous system didn't get the architectural update. It still thinks the threat is current. The fire crackled. Outside, the mountain was silent. You did that in 40 seconds, he said. I've had a lot of practice. He sat down, not close, across the room, in the chair by the opposite window. 300 offenders, he said. You said you interviewed over 300. 341 as of last month. She picked up her pen. You want to ask me something? What do you study? He said, specifically. The gap, she said, between what people do and why they believe they do it. Most violent actors have a narrative, a story they tell themselves about their choices that makes the choices coherent. My work is about understanding the construction of that narrative, not to excuse behavior, to understand it, because understanding is the only thing that's ever actually changed anything. And what narrative do men like me construct? She looked at him for a moment. Would you like the version I'd write in an academic paper or the version I'd actually say? The second one. Men who build organizations like this one, she said, usually started somewhere small with something real, a genuine injustice, a legitimate protection of something they valued. The violence was a tool and the tool worked. And then the tool became the identity. She didn't look away. The most dangerous version is the man who knows this, who can see it clearly and has chosen it anyway, because that version can't be talked out of anything. He's thought further than the argument goes. A pause. That's you, I think. He said nothing for a long time. Then, yes. One word, more honest than he'd been with anyone in 9 years. Something shifted in the room, not dramatically, the way pressure shifts before weather changes, a thing felt before it's understood. On the fourth day, she said, tell me about the night it started. They were in the library again. It had become the room, the place with no formal weight, no operational meaning, which perhaps was why language moved differently there. The night what started, he said, though he knew. The insomnia, she had her notepad, she always had her notepad. You said 9 years, what happened? He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. She didn't press. She had a professional-grade understanding of when silence was a wall and when it was a door. This was a door. I had a partner, he said finally. Not personal, organizational, someone who helped me build the early structure. I trusted him further than I've trusted anyone before or since. He paused. The words were coming out slowly, like something being excavated. He was selling intelligence on our operations to a rival network for 2 years before I found out. 18 people died because of information he gave away. Some of them were, he stopped. Some of them were not combatants. They were people adjacent to this who shouldn't have been. The fire. The mountain. When I found out, he said, I didn't sleep. And then the days went by and the operation continued, and there was always something requiring attention, requiring action, and the not sleeping became the condition, the baseline. He looked at the window. I think some part of my mind decided that sleeping was what had allowed it to happen, that if I was always partially awake, it would never happen again. Ocebiel set down her pen very quietly. Your brain, she said, gently, she could be gentle, he'd noticed, in the precise moments where gentleness was the more accurate tool, has been doing its job, extremely, exhaustingly, sustainedly doing its job. It learned that unconsciousness equals vulnerability equals catastrophic loss, so it protects you. A pause. The problem is that it's protecting you from something that isn't coming the same way again, and it doesn't know how to tell the difference. He looked at her. You've spent 9 years, she said, in a body that thinks it's still in that night. The room was very quiet. He had spoken to psychiatrists. He had spoken to doctors. He had been handed diagnoses and prescriptions and clinical frameworks. None of them had said it like that, in that specific way that made it feel not like a pathology to be managed, but like a story he'd been trapped inside that had an outside. Can it be changed? He said. Yes, she said, steady, not falsely bright, just factual, not quickly, not by talking once, but yes. She tilted her head. There are specific interventions, reconsolidation work. It's where we access the original memory under a state of stability rather than threat, and give the brain a chance to update its prediction. To learn that things are different now. She paused. It requires going back to that night in a very structured way, sitting with it differently. That sounds, he said, like the opposite of what I want to do. I know, she said, it usually does. He was quiet. Then, you're a forensic consultant. You've helped build cases against men like me. Yes. Why would you help me? She considered this with the honesty she'd shown from the first moment. The quality he'd realized was not a strategy, but simply what she was. I'm a psychologist, she said, before I'm anything else, and you're a person in significant psychological pain who I have the expertise to help. She looked at him directly. I'm also not naive. I know who you are. I know what the organization you run does. I'm not helping you run it. I'm helping you sleep. She paused. I believe those are different things. He studied her, this woman who had been taken from her ordinary night, who had faced her possible death with a clear-eyed speech about logistics, who had been in his library for 4 days and had somehow become the most honest conversation he'd had in a decade. All right, he said. All right, what? Do it, he said, the reconsolidation, whatever it involves. He said it like a man who had run out of reasons not to. She nodded once and picked up her pen. What followed was not a dramatic unraveling. It was slow, technical, and at several points deeply uncomfortable in the specific way that honest reckoning always is. She worked with him in the evenings, after the day's operational weight had settled, an hour at a time. She was meticulous about structure. This was not conversation as therapy, it was a specific clinical approach, and she maintained its architecture even in the informality of the library, even across the firelight, even as the distance between professional engagement and something without a clinical name quietly and without announcement began to shrink. On the first evening she had him describe, in detail and in the present tense, the room where he'd received the news about his former partner, the precise details, the color of the walls, the temperature, what he'd eaten that day. The technique required re-inhabiting the sensory context without being capsized by it. She guided him through it with a steady voice that he'd later think of as sounding like a lighthouse, not rescuing, just marking where the rocks were. On the second evening, she had him identify what his body felt at the moment the information landed, not his thoughts, his body, his hands, his chest, the physical architecture of the night. He found this harder than anything operational he had done in 9 years. She waited. She was extraordinarily patient, not performatively, not in the way people perform patience to seem virtuous. She was patient the way a skilled craftsperson is patient, because she understood that the material required time and rushing it would ruin it. On the fourth evening, she had him say out loud what the loss had actually been, not the 18 people, not the operational damage, the specific private loss. The belief, he said slowly, that I understood who people were. She nodded. She wrote something, she said, and do you still believe you can't? He thought about it for longer than he expected to. I understood you, he said finally, within the first 10 minutes. She looked up from her notepad. Something passed between them. It was not acted upon. It was simply registered by both of them. And then she continued the session, and he continued being honest in ways he'd forgotten he was capable of, and the evening moved on. But it stayed in the room, even after the words did. He began sleeping 4 hours on the 9th day. He didn't tell her immediately. He waited until he'd done it twice more to make sure it wasn't anomalous. On the third night, he knocked on the library door at 7 a.m. She was always there first, and stood in the doorway and said, 4 hours, 3 nights in a row. She looked up. The expression on her face was not triumphant. It was not the face of someone who'd solved a puzzle. It was softer than that, more private, the expression of someone for whom good news about another person's well-being is genuinely, uncomplexly good news. That's significant, she said. Yes. How does it feel? He looked at her. Outside the library window, the mountain morning was doing something extraordinary with the light. Strange, he said, like finding a room in a building you've lived in for 9 years. She set down her pen. She looked at him. He was still in the doorway. The library was between them like a landscape. Kwan Ixian, she said, I need to go home. I know, he said. I've been here 2 weeks. I know. My students have exams next month. I have 3 case consultations pending. There are people who need to know I'm all right. She paused. I need to go home. I know, he said for the 3rd time, and then I'll arrange it. She nodded. She should have left it there. She was a woman of extraordinary precision about things, but she looked at him, at the face that had learned to give nothing away, that was currently giving something away in the specific arrangement of what it was trying not to show, and said, what I said about understanding on the 4th evening. He was very still. I understood you within the first 10 minutes too, she said quietly. I want you to know that. He didn't move. She picked up her book and went back to reading, which was either the bravest or the kindest thing she could have done, because it meant he didn't have to respond while his face was doing whatever it was doing. She left on a Wednesday. One of his cars took her to the city. She walked back into her life, her office, her students, the pending consultations, the organized professional world where her name meant something clean and credential certified. Her colleagues had been told she'd had a family emergency. No one questioned it. She was known for being private. She sat in her office that first evening, surrounded by her things, her degrees on the wall, the framed photograph of her research team, the stacked case files, and the ordinary texture of her life felt like a coat that had been her size before she'd left and wasn't quite now anymore. She did not contact him. He did not contact her. 12 days passed. Then she received, with no cover letter, no explanation, and no return address, a delivery, a book she had mentioned once in passing, a rare 1970s translated collection of research on attachment theory she'd been trying to locate for her ongoing academic work. Out of print, difficult to find. She held it for a long time. She opened the inside cover. There was a single line of handwriting, not his name, no signature at all. It said, 7 hours last night, I thought you should know. She sat with this for 2 days. She consulted exactly no one. She was, professionally, an expert in other people's interior architectures, and personally, someone who had always found her own more difficult to navigate. On the 3rd day, she sent a message to an encrypted contact number she should not have had and had anyway. It said, what are you doing Sunday? His reply came 20 minutes later. Losing at Baduk to myself, as usual. She wrote back, I play Baduk. He wrote, I know, you mentioned it the 2nd day. You beat your university professor and he failed you on a paper the following week. She stared at her phone. He'd remembered a single detail from a conversation 2 weeks ago. She wrote, is that why you read so carefully? You don't want to miss things. A longer pause this time. Then, after 9 years of missing the most important thing, yes. She put her phone down. She looked at her office. She looked at her degrees and her files and the clean architecture of her established life. And she thought about a man in a mountain library losing a game to himself and the particular quality of honesty that had lived between them in that firelit room. She picked her phone back up. She wrote, I'll come Sunday. I'll bring my own stones. What happened after that was not a story anyone would tell at a dinner party. It was not clean, and it was not without complication. She was, professionally, someone who served the systems he operated against. They were never naive about this. She wasn't the kind of woman who softened inconvenient truths, and he wasn't the kind of man who needed her to. They held the contradiction because the alternative was pretending it wasn't there, and neither of them had ever been interested in pretending. She did not ask him to become someone else. He did not ask her to become someone else. These are the negotiations that sink most things before they begin. What she asked was simple and enormous, that he be honest with her, always. What he asked in return was something he had not asked another human being in 9 years, that she stay. Not forever, in a single dramatic declaration. Just Sunday. And then the Sunday after that. There is a particular kind of strength that does not look like strength. It does not announce itself. It does not require an audience. It lives in the willingness to sit in an honest room with another person and not flinch from what you find there. She had it from the first moment in the East Room with her ankles crossed and her voice steady. He had been working toward it, painfully and imperfectly, for the better part of a decade, toward the version of strength that isn't armor. She had not rescued him, he had not saved her. They had simply, and this is rarer than either violence or romance, seen each other, clearly, without the adjustments people make for their own comfort. And they had decided, each of them, privately and without ceremony, that being seen was worth the risk of what seeing required. Months later, she would present a paper at an international conference on behavioral reconsolidation and trauma-informed intervention. It was considered landmark work. She received a standing ovation. Afterward, 3 colleagues asked who her most remarkable clinical case had been. She smiled. She said she couldn't discuss individual cases. She flew home on a Sunday morning. He picked her up from the airport himself. He was leaning against the car with his arms folded, looking in the wrong direction. She was coming from the opposite gate, and there was a moment, watching him before he saw her, where she caught something on his face she hadn't expected to catch. He looked like someone waiting for something they couldn't believe they'd been allowed to want. She walked up beside him. He turned. He said nothing, she said nothing. The airport moved around them in its ordinary rushing chaos. She handed him her carry-on, and they walked to the car. Inside, he drove. She looked out the window at Seoul in the late morning light. "How did you sleep?" she said. 7 hours, he said. "I'm going to reach 8 eventually. I want you to know I take the research seriously." "You're very competitive about sleep recovery," she said. "I'm competitive about everything." "I know," a pause. "It's one of your more manageable traits." The corner of his mouth did the thing it had started doing, the thing that lived between a smile and its more honest predecessor. "One of," he said. "One of," she confirmed. The city moved past them, layered and bright and complicated, the way cities are, the way lives are, the way the best things always are, not simple, not without shadow, but genuinely, stubbornly, specifically worth it. The star just before dawn always appears in the darkest part of the night. That is not coincidence. That is its function.